Okay, gonna be doing a little retrospective today on the Melting Remnant clan. I plan on doing this for every clan. Figured I would start with the Melting Remnant because I do think they've gone through probably the most significant changes from the point I started playing onward. And on that note, I will say I am only really evaluating this from the point I've started playing on forward, which would have been the 1.0 release. I'm not going to look at any cards at how they existed prior to 1.0. So this would be around like 2020, summer of 2020. So anyway, this is the first page we're going to look at here. This is how the logbook would have looked like in 1.0 if you're looking at the commons for Melting Remnant. So interesting thing to note, just looking at as a whole, is a lot of these have gone through changes. You know, of the 9 cards here, you could count it as 8 if you're just looking at, like, you know, draftable cards, not starters like a drag. 6 of the 8 cards here have gotten just straight up buffs. Only 2 of them have been unchanged, and I'd even argue that they have implicit changes based on other changes that have happened, but we'll just kind of go through everything. So first we have drag. Hasn't ever changed from when I started playing this game onward. It's always been a 0 cost, 1 pip, 9/3 burnout 2 unit. And it's always, to me, felt horrible as a secondary. Like if I have Melting Remnant secondary with drags, it just doesn't feel good a lot of the time. But it feels less bad with Rector. You know, Rector, particularly the Dark Calling path and to some degree the Harvest path, can make good use of those drags. You know, early on, the drags can basically solo the first 3 rings if you're playing Dark Calling efficiently. And it just provides extra harvest for Harvest Rector. But not much more. I won't get too much into the weeds with drags, because this is really more of just a, you know, then versus now thing, and drags really hasn't changed, right? I've never thought they're that good. Hollow Drippings. So this card obviously had a change, and that was that the burnout increased from 3 to 5. Everything else about the card is the same. Implicitly, a double stack upgrade, you know, now costs an extra ember. Back then it didn't. I don't think that really changes anything on this card too much. I think simply you basically get a double, like the old version double stacked is nearly the amount of burnout you get now, not double stacked, right? So I would say it's definitely a buff, even with you factoring in the double stack change. And on top of being a buff, it's just, in my eyes, it's hard to say, because I was significantly a worse player back then than I am now, right? You know, maybe I didn't see the forest through the trees enough, or maybe I didn't experiment quite enough, but I always felt in the 1.0 version of this game that Burnout Extension was just a horrible way to go about trying to beat the game. Like, Reform was really just king. I mean, you look at these cards and, you know, we'll see it on the next page, but like Paraffin Enforcer was weaker. You didn't have essences, like Draft can't like go into things. There was no little fade, there was no primitive molds, like Wicklash gave half the actual damage extension. Fade's First Blade did not, or was it? Yeah, Fade's First Blade did not exist. There just really wasn't a whole lot of incentive to keep things alive in Burnout. Especially when all the actual Burnout extension cards were just weaker. You know, we'll get to Wax and Spike, but even Wax and Spike gave a 1/4 of the Burnout it does now. So yeah, it's like this card, I guess it gives you Burnout extension. I still would take it every now and then for like Relentless. But usually my ideal game plan back then was to take Burnout Rector. I would like to see this card because it, you know, even if it's not a molded, it enables me to probably take Burnout Rector and hopefully eventually find a molded or man, what is the name of that card? Let's go forward. Let's cheat and go forward a little bit. What is it? Wicked Blaze. I can never remember the name of that goddamn card. But yeah, you know, all of these burnout extension cards, I didn't really take them that much back then, other than, you know, to help get Burnout Rector going. It never was like a game plan of mine that often to keep things in Burnout extension, and wow, how much has changed since then, right? You know, now I would always try to get a Burnout extension plan going if I can help it, unless there's a Hallowed Halls. Hallowed Halls changes things. But you know, that's Hallowed Drippings. Purifying Cleanse, similar story. It heals for more now. It does 15 instead of 10, and it just gives an extra burnout, 3 burnout. Definitely a much better card now, both just flat stat-wise and also in the context that burnout extension is better. So also like healing the unit is better, right? And the heal is better on it. And now you can spell chain it. You know, there's just a lot more you can do with this card now. Back then it was not that good of a card in my opinion. Like, it was actually kind of a bad card. Of all the burnout extension cards, it was the worst. Now I could argue it's in a lot of runs it's the best, I would say. Even more than Wicklash. I know everybody likes Wicklash, but for me, Purifying Cleanse is now the best, in a general sense, burnout extension card. But back then it was just, I don't know, it's kind of a bad card in my opinion. Giraffe, interesting one. This card technically is unchanged, but everything about it has changed since then. You know, now we have DLC. It is an incredibly strong infusion, so usually you're taking it just for that. Back then, you didn't have that option, but then, you know, if we can extend that a bit, you know, Burnout Extension sucked. The actual ability to Burnout Extend sucked. You couldn't add intrinsic to cards. It was harder to thin out your deck. You know, there's just more gold, and there's Purge opportunity at Divine Temples now. There just wasn't quite all these options to make even a Giraffe itself work back then. I will say, though, out of all the commons, Giraffe is still probably one of the better ones. It just was really awkward. It was really awkward because there was no primitive molds, you know. It's at its best with Dark Calling Rector, but I'll get to Dark Calling later. It's possible that Dark Calling was okay, but I just never played it back then, and I'll kind of show you why. So, you know, taking all that into factor, considering only the first 2 rings are you going to get offered common drafts, it's really hard to take a draft. You know, I would usually need a molded first. It's kind of hard for me to take a draft if I don't have Dark Calling, which I never would have chose back then. And yeah, so it often just never made sense to me to add these to a deck. And just to reiterate, adding it meant, at best, it's just going to be a draft, you know. It's not going to represent multi-strike in some other unit. And then Entombed Explosive, it was just, it wasn't untakeable, but it was just pretty underwhelming at 35 damage. It is kind of interesting how just a 15 damage increase definitely made the card better. The problem with 35 is, like, it didn't kill anything early game. You know, it didn't kill any of the tanks. Maybe it would kill the shield dudes, but kind of who cares, I would say. I mean, it's not nothing, but really I would love to be able to kill, like, you know, the whatever you call them, the Heaven's Priests, hooded dudes with an axe. Now you can do that with 50 damage, but back then 35 didn't cut it. It just softened them up a pretty good amount, but you'd have to finish them off with something else. It also had 5 health, which was awkward. Like, you know, if I go back to Heaven's Priests, if they're just doing 2 damage, they're not going to kill it. They're going to need a trial that adds their damage, or they're going to need to be the second wave where there's a crossbow man behind it to even blow it up in the first place. So, you know, now it does 50 damage and it has 1 health. It's very interesting to me. It's very interesting to me that first off, let me just commend them on that change. It's a good change all around. It never made the card OP. It made it usable, and the change in health just made a lot of sense. I guess my complaint is it's weird that they recognize the value of putting it at 1 health, but still never changed Melting Spout. You know, Melting Spout is the artifact that adds 30 health and 1 burnout. You know, the 1 burnout is fine, but the 30 health just is weird. I guess because you're adding burnout, it's okay, kinda, but I don't know. That artifact has never sat well with me. It's just a weird artifact. I feel like it's an artifact that often is untakeable, especially if you already have burnout on the card, but even if you don't, it's just a weird one to me to take. But I don't know. Just a minor complaint I had. Try not to get on too many tangents here. It's going to be hard for me not to. And then we get to Molded. Now, it's interesting because I still like the card, but back in the day, this was like the prized possession of Melting Remnant cards, especially the commons. You know, it stood head and shoulders above all the other commons. It was like, you know how razor sharp edge is often with an Awoken run right now, as far as commons go? It was like even more intense than that, I would say, in terms of like, oh, this run has Molded or this run doesn't have Molded, right? Molded really enabled the most consistent lines to victory, I would say, back in the 1.0 days of Melting Remnant. If you think about it, it had better scaling than Wicklash even, right? Because it's still technically, assuming you're like able to play it a lot, either through hellventing them and thinning the deck out, or ideally a holdover, you're getting the same amount of damage. You know, 5, Wicklash does 5, Molded does 5, just by nature of reform, but you're also getting 5 health, and you're actually, in the long run, kind of getting more burnout, while also healing the unit, right? And then also it represents, because, you know, in these days, Last Divinity as a boss wasn't there, it represented the ability, especially if you had it on holdover and permafrost, or permafrost, to basically play your units, your main units that you were focusing on, up all 3 floors in each relentless combat. You know, I would argue, in relation to how it is now, Molded was a stronger card back then, especially like, I would use it more now if Divinity was a little better designed of a fight. I hate to be harsh like that, because I will say, I gotta give the devs the credit where credit is due. Almost every change we're gonna outline here is a good change, right? They've done a great job with this game, but I also am critical where criticalness, is that a word? Criticalness is due. So like, I've always thought the fact that there's a few things I just don't like about the last Divinity fight. And a big one is the way that the Relentless is performed. I think that they could have handled it in a way that opens up more strategies and also nerfs a little more of the just common snowball strategies. Or not really snowball, but just kind of nerf the brainless, like play top every type floor, top floor every game type of game plan. So I'm just going to throw this out there. It's probably, you know, whatever. I'm not a game designer, but, you know, the problem is you can't do that Molded strategy anymore, right? Because, you know, whatever you are in Relentless, that's it, right? You're not going to be able to reform up each 3 floors. I think that the way, because you know, and I'm not saying it's not unusable to do that strategy, it's just way harder to pull off, because you really have to get your stuff reformed with the right amount of health, with the right amount of burnout on the very right amount of turn, and to actually coordinate that is quite hard. And also you just need to have enough stats to get through that final Relentless area. But I think they could get around this and also open up a few more things, such as Siliphyte. You know, actually using the spell weakness portion of Siliphyte, and actually using like Tethys Sweep and bottom floor setups in general, even Frostbite. The idea that I had is that basically the Relentless would happen just as it classically does. You know, it first happens on the bottom floor, and then once that's done, you know, everything moves up as it normally does. You'd probably have to start Relentless a turn earlier so that there's not an empty floor. But then, you know, my thought is any sort of debuffs or buffs that were present on the feet, you know, then get transferred to the midsection at that point, after that Relentless floor freezes. And then you get another turn. You know, you can shoot in your shots if you have them. Then you can actually stack those relentless things of spell weakness in the case of a Silliphite or a Tethys, and actually cash in on them like you should be able to, right? Similarly, if you had a molded strategy, you could now reform your units up like you normally would, but there would be a downside, obviously. The downside would be that I think a portion of the health, I don't think it would be fair to take all the health, but I think a portion of the health, don't ask me what that portion should be. There just need to be play testing to figure out what the right number is, but a portion of that health that is still left over on the feet should then carry up to the midsection. And then, you know, let that round play out into the same thing on up to the head. Now these builds that are just kind of, you know, going top, they will actually, if nothing was ever done to the bottom or mid floor, you got a lot more health to deal with, and now you actually have a relentless fight that might mean something. Because how rare is it that relentless, when you're doing a top floor standard setup, ever kills you in Divinity? No, you're either dying to the waves or you've won, right? Very rare you just die to relentless. So I think overall it would make the game better and just open up more strategies, while also just kind of making some strategies harder that need to be harder, right? That's my little tangent there. Long story short, Molded just used to be the king of everything. Now, it isn't really now, but it's obviously still a good card to have. Molten Encasement. It was about half as effective, right? It gave Stealth 1 instead of Stealth 2. And it had the same problem of having 5 health versus 1. Then they upped it to Stealth 2 and took the health down to 1 eventually, which made it an incredible card. I wonder if it was still an okay card at Stealth 1. There's a few of these cards where I do wonder if, you know, the fact that they felt a bit underwhelming at a baseline shied us away, or at least shied me away from using a game plan that's centered around them, because now it's pretty common for me to take a Molten Encasement, put it on Endless, or even just reform it a bunch, and that can really just carry a run, at least defensively, right? I wonder if literally halving the stealth back then meant that it wasn't usable. Interesting thought experiment. But anyway, I will say that I hardly ever took it back then. At Stealth 1 it just felt like crap to me. Especially when we'll get to it later, but Engulfed in Smoke was just such an objectively better card. I mean, Engulfed in Smoke is about the only card on this list that actually got a nerf. You'll see. Then you had Wicklash. Of the Burnout extension, it's the only one that didn't gain actual Burnout extension, but what it did gain is literally double the attack. And I will say back then I thought it was a pretty crap card. But when it got to 10, now we're talking razor sharp edge levels of damage scaling. Pretty good. So definitely a good card now. I think the Burnout 2 can still be an issue in some runs if you don't have other, if you don't find Holdover and you don't find other forms of Burnout extension. It's a weird card still. However, hard to deny how good that 10 is. Often you don't really build a Burnout extension deck, but you just have this on Holdover, and then you don't care about the Burnout, and you just care that it's, you know, giving you razor sharp edge levels of attack. But, you know, back then 5 attack was pretty underwhelming. I mean, you know, that's about on the level of a Sharpen. I guess it's still technically better than Sharpen, but because it costs 1. But yeah, I don't know. I never thought Wicklash was great. But then talking about not great, Dripfall. Holy shit, this card sucked. This card was so bad. Look at it, 2 cost, and it just descends the unit. No days, no nothing. Oh my god, there was just never hardly any reason to ever take this card, and you were always so sad to see it in your opener. You're like, great. 2 absolute deadweights. Every now and then you could do something with it, right? You could... I mean, if you think about it, it's essentially like... It's a Restoring Retreat. Dare I say it was still better than Restoring Retreat, because how often are you using Restoring Retreat to heal your guys? Like, you're often using it on enemies, so it's just healing the enemy. And if you are using it on your own character, usually they're not hurt anyway, because you're just using it to overstack a floor. So, as bad as it was, it's still technically mildly better than Restoring Retreat. So I guess it still found its way into some of my decks, just for the overstacking capability. But then again, I didn't really overstack floors with Melting Remnant. It would only find its way in if I was kind of, usually if melting was a secondary, I guess, because, you know, I might not be so inclined to try to make a molded strategy work if I was like, say, Penumbra main going Gorge or something, like, I don't know. But even then, I probably wouldn't overstack a floor anyhow, so I don't know. It didn't really make sense for melting at the time for me to overstack much with it, because usually if I was going with the melting stuff, is molded, is all about molded. So yeah, obviously now it's much better. 1 Ember costs half the Ember, and it applies Dazed, so often it's just really good for enemies. Like, you know, it can even be good into Relentless. It's a way to set up top if you want. Just hold over Dripfall, they'll be dazing Divinity every turn. There's a lot you can do with the card now. And I still wouldn't say it's necessarily an S tier card. Like, it's a weird card still, right? Like, there's a few of these cards like Entombed Explosive and Dripfall that don't really give you a straight up game plan, which is usually what you're looking for in your first 2 rings of these commons. So it's usually something I can have a bit more confidence to take nowadays if I already have some other game plan going. Then it's just a nice card to have, but it is hard for me to take it like with that first draft if I don't really have some sort of game plan. But sometimes Dripfall can be a game plan, right? Technically, you can use it to overstack. I rarely do it for that still, with the Dazed even, and having it costing less. But you can just have it, like, especially if you get an early empty drop cage, like, your game plan could just be stall out and stun everything a ton of times. Like, that's perfectly acceptable, but back then it wasn't. I suppose with an empty drop cage it still was, but still it's a 2 cost. It just sucked. You're gonna have to take my word, it just sucked, man. It was the worst. Now we get on to the uncommons. I mean, you'll notice right off the bat, this one, Intent on Death, was an uncommon, so it's a rare now. But in the initial game, it was an uncommon. Now, the funny thing is, like, technically, if in a vacuum, this is the strongest version of the card, right? It costs 0. It doesn't consume. It's an uncommon, so you find it well over half of every run. However, what's the context of what extinguishes, right? Only the tomb units. And a legion, I guess. But, you know, Little Fade didn't exist back then. I don't know. I just never felt it was that good of a card. Some people swear by the fact that you could, you know, use it on a melt. If you just, you know, if I go back to Molten Encasement, you could basically stick one of these on a floor and then hold over Intent on Death would be like endless stealth to that floor, but I don't know, even then it was only 1 stealth back then. I don't know, I never thought it was that good of a card. It's a much better card now. It's actually gone through 2 different iterations, and the second iteration is probably where it was at its strongest. So once Little Fade became a thing, they changed it to be a rare, and then it became a 2 cost, but it still didn't consume. So it was pretty easy to get it on a holdover and then just bring it down to a 1 cost. I would say that was the most powerful variant of the card, because you could just break runs with that. If you had Firelight or even Endless Fade, you could break the run. The old version of Endless Fade is a little different. But we're not going to get into that here because Fade wasn't really in the 1.0. Long story short, I just don't think Intent on Death was good back then. Like, if all it could do is like summon a few extra drafts, get an extra 35 damage out of an Entombed Explosive. You know, maybe there's some world where Devour of Death it was good on. I never made that work though. So yeah. And then Memories of the Melted has not changed at all. Never liked the design of this card. It just doesn't make sense to me for this to be in the Melting Remnant clan, because even back then there just wasn't anything that costed much. You know? They had 1 X cost card. It was a bad X cost card, Wax and Spike. Nothing, hardly anything cost 2 or more. Even Engulfed in Smoke, we'll get to that in a bit, it only costed 1. So I don't know. Why does this card exist in Melting? I don't know. Still don't like the card. I take it a little bit more now because at the end of the day, it is an etch trigger. It is an inspire. It's an inspire if, you know, it's fused or you have Bog Slime and it's an incant. So every now and then it'll make it into a deck, but it never makes it in for the actual gaining of Ember portion of it. It never does. I can't even maybe deep in my well over 1,000 runs, maybe there's a run I'm forgetting about where I actually used it for the Ember portion, but nah, didn't like it then, don't like it now. Then Sacred Wicks is similar to Memories the Melted in that it's a consume that costs 0, and for those reasons I might take it. And at least the actual effect I can make use of. The ironic thing here is I used it far less back in the day because targeted reform was just king. Now I don't know how much of that has to do with just, you know, before Primitive Mold was a thing, it seemed like more of a reach to make a deck where I couldn't just like willy-nilly throw stuff out, like throw down dregs and whatnot. Like I guess what I'm saying is rarely would I ever think along the lines of like curating my reform pool, because I would never think of that just on the chance that I get a Sacred Wicks, right? So I don't know. I've never actually thought Sacred Wicks is that good. It technically is pretty valuable, but it's kind of just, usually I'm taking it in a Primitive Mold deck is the weird thing. So back in the context of 1.0 when Primitive Molds weren't a thing, it didn't really make sense in my decks unless I had completely whiffed on Molded or Wicked Blaze. And even then, it's really hard to make this work because, like, keep in mind, we really just a single reform wasn't good enough. Especially when you kind of figure that there's so much of a lack of scaling in the 1.0 version of this clan. So, like, you have to find consume on it, and you kind of have to then find holdover on it. And then on top of that, you can't really just willy-nilly play out drags and stuff. So there's a lot going against it in the 1.0. I'm willing to concede that maybe it's better than I gave it credit for, but certainly I think back to then and I really never used this card that much. Now, Crushing Demise, here's a card that has always been good. Always surprised that it never got a nerf, but I guess back then, as they were slowly kind of buffing the clan, they needed to keep some stuff OP just to make the clan still be like playable. And certainly Crushing Demise is an OP card. Like, you could nerf that to 2 Ember at least, and it would still be a great card. But yeah, I would say it was arguably even more powerful back then because there were less units on there wasn't the divinity fight. It's kind of a catch-22, right? Like, it's amazing in the divinity fight for killing the mini bosses, but it can be a little inconsistent if you can't combine it with AoE for like the general waves. You know, it might just kill a healer versus a tank. But might I also add that it was an incredible card back then in the context that, like, holdover molded was such a good thing, and this just guaranteed I could have a molded target every turn. You know, it was very common for me to just run Burnout Rector and some backliner. Anything would do. And a holdover Crushing Demise plus a holdover molded was almost impossible to lose any run like that. That's, if you had those 2 cards, those 2 upgrades, the match was over. You're not going to lose that one. You're getting a ton of stats on your units, and once, you know, you're going to deal with the waves just fine, and eventually Relentless hits, and you got 3 entire floors of incredibly statted up units, at least in the context of 1.0, with enough burnout that they'll last pretty much the whole fight into Relentless each floor. So it's just very hard to lose with that combo. And then Engulfed in Smoke here. Can you believe this one used to cost 1? And you can couple that with the fact that Double Stack didn't use to increase the Ember. So you could get a double stack on this, it would remain 1 Ember and give 4 stealth to your units. It was ridiculous. Either way, though, it was an incredible card. This was a card, you know, kind of this and Crushing Demise were kind of the highlights of Melting Remnant, to be honest, when a lot of people kind of just never used Melting Remnant for anything, especially if they were secondary. But, like, they would just be like, I just want to get an Engulfed in Smoke, hopefully, but otherwise just nothing else does anything for me. You know, keep in mind, it's very much in the infancy of the game where strategies weren't laid out and stuff, but it makes sense, right? A lot of these other things were just either weak or required a lot of setup to happen. But if you just had a non-melting floor, you know, whatever the other clan was, and then you just find an Engulfed in Smoke, then you're sitting pretty nice. You know, your defense is definitely taken care of. But yeah, so this got nerfed to 2 Ember. Definitely a reasonable nerf. It's still a very powerful card in my opinion, though I might think a Molten Encasement can be a little bit better. Lady of the House, this card was always filling, I guess, the role it does still. It was a decently statted card that didn't have much of a ceiling, but certainly was really good when you immediately took it, and then potentially fell off later if you didn't get kind of a good setup for it. But it did get buffed since then. It's 35-45 now, so 10 extra damage, 5 extra health. It's an okay buff for sure, but I don't think it really changes the core of what the card is, which is just a good early game pickup that potentially will be useless later on, but isn't always. Lady of the Reformed, this unit hasn't changed at all. Same stat line, same burnout, same revenge effect. It was a good tank. I mean, 40 HP on 2 pip has always been a good thing. But I might just add that in the context that burnout extension sucked, or at least it seemed to suck, it wasn't really that good of a card in 1.0 in my opinion. Then Paraffin Enforcer, this is a hilarious one. I do kind of wonder, this one's similar to me with like vanilla Fledgling Imp. I wonder if it actually was a good card all along and I just never always overlooked it. But certainly it's an incredible card now. You know, it gets an extra rage on attack. Eventually they upped the stats on the base unit as well. It went up to just 10 more health, so 15-25. Not a huge buff, but still makes it able to frontline a bit better. You often might want to frontline with it, right? Because you want it to hit before the other things so that they all get rage. But yeah, I mean, Rage 2 should have still been decently strong, I feel, but for whatever reason, I think maybe just because Burnout Extensions kind of was underwhelming, I never really found myself using the card that much in 1.0. It also didn't work that well with the fact that I was often wanting to kill my own units and reform them quite often. And obviously, the DLC changes a lot with the ability to put a draft into it, or put it into a draft, or just self-infuse it, or put it onto anything really. It's a really powerful essence. So I don't know. I even wonder, like, pre-DLC, was it as incredible as it is now? I don't think so. I think it was pretty good in its Rage 3 form, but it was probably quite usable in the Rage 2 form. I'll tell you what, though, I hardly ever used the unit, which is so funny when I look at the next unit, Paraffin Thug. I probably, of every banner unit that isn't a rare, you know, all the uncommon banner units, was probably the one I used the most. It was Paraffin Thug, because it just fit the game plan of what I was trying to do the best. It had the most damage other than Lady of the House, but it had a really, you know, pretty good slay effect. And the low health and no initial burnout kind of helped my game plan. It was very common for me to just fish for a burnout 1 upgrade on Paraffin Thug. That way I could get it starting into the reform pool immediately, and then reform it as many times as possible to scale it up as fast as I could. And then, yeah, it usually just got me a lot of gold. It did the most damage, usually, out of any of the melting units. And the low health was a positive. It actually got changed at one point to have 10 health instead of 3, which is funny because in 1.0, I actually think it would be worse at 10 health than 3. Like, literally, the ability to kill it with, like, say, 2 torches or 1 vine grasp was a good thing. Or even have it die to spikes. Like, we wanted this thing to die in the vanilla game. So it's interesting that it eventually got 10 health. I think it's a horrible unit now. You know, not much changed other than it got health, but just the actual... you know, it just doesn't do enough. It's very hard to justify a horrible... Like in the context of the DLC world, it's a horrible statted unit. With a effect that... You gotta put a lot of effort into this unit to get that effect, and I'm not even convinced the payoff is that much worth it. Then we have Remnant Host. Only real change here is it went down to 1 health, and instead of 1 ember, it's 0. I suppose in 1.0 it might have been the best tomb, because it technically did more, or I guess, yeah, it did more damage technically, assuming the drafts survived, than Entombed Explosive. And yet it also just gave a lot of harvest triggers. Problem was, harvest kind of sucked back then though, so I don't know. Certainly pre-DLC I use this card a lot though. Post-DLC it doesn't really find its way into too many of my decks. But definitely once they buffed harvest, this became better. Then resin removal, no changes there other than I would say that I thought this card was pretty useless back then, because there just wasn't much to remove. Keep in mind, Seraph the Patient did not exist back then, so you didn't really have the melee weakness to remove. Enemies hardly ever had stealth. Only floor 5 had stealth. And only, you know, one of the groups, one of the bosses had it. And to be honest, since usually I'm trying to do a reform strategy, I would have no problem with the stealth boss, so I don't know. I almost never took resin removal, and I was disappointed to see it in my opening deck whenever it was there. It just seemed like it didn't really do anything. Now it has a lot more, because like a lot of enemies have spell shield, damage shield, spikes. Oh, you'll have melee weakness on your own units. There's a lot more reason to take it now. Vetivery was essentially the same card, except it costed 1 ember, so there was like an investment to it. It is pretty interesting how much more takeable it is at 0 ember versus 1, because at 1 it's like, why would I use this unit? You know, it was always a waxer, so it's not like you're getting tomb synergy from the like what 2 artifacts there are anyway, but you know, it doesn't even have that. And I guess technically you could still get the infinite back then, because the double, you know, waxer snuffer existed. But yeah, I guess you'd have to I don't know what the use case for this other than an infinite was back then, because now it's just kind of a 0 investment thing you can add in and get like harvest triggers out of it. But yeah, never liked it back then. Plus it has a pretty good essence now, right? Endless. But yeah, the only change is it just went down to 0 ember. Then Wickless Baron, you'll notice it just wasn't nearly as good back then. It's only harvested 1 attack. It still had 3 health. Eventually they brought that up to 3 attack. And once that happened, now this unit was in a pretty good spot. So there was kind of a period pre-DLC where this was one of the better banners in the game, I would say. It arguably was better than Harvest Rector. And we'll get to that in a bit. But yeah, in the initial form, I don't think it was very good other than being purely a tank. But purely a tank just wasn't that needed back in the day for melting, in my opinion. Usually Rector, if I was primary, Rector is going to be the tank in one form or another. Then Tycoon, I don't know, I never liked this unit. Some people do, more power to them. They did change it to be a 10-25 eventually. Ooh-wee, 7 extra damage, 5 health, what a unit now, right? Yeah, I never thought it was that good. I still don't think it's that good. It's a weird unit to me, because it's like, I have to assume if you add it, you're planning on removing it later, so you gain some gold, and then you have to spend the gold to remove it, and then it increases the amount of gold for any other removal. I guess the only time it makes sense is when you hit enough unstable vortexes that you never had to make any removals with gold. Then I guess you're getting a net positive, but seems pretty specific to me. I don't really understand why people like Tycoons so much, but I'm not saying that it can't be good, because if people have good results with it, then more power to them, either back then or now. I'm just saying with my experience, it's never been a good unit. Every time I take it, I usually regret it. Fatal Melting has technically had no changes other than, it is funny, there was a bug that existed at one point. I never got to experience it, but apparently there were ways that you could basically get that damage bonus. So you deal damage equal to the enemy units, you know, times that die, or the friendly units that died times 3. You could get that bonus to carry over from run to run somehow. And they did fix that bug at some point, but that's pretty funny to me that that technically is a nerf to the card, right? I actually think the card has gotten better since the DLC came out, even though the card itself hasn't changed. Just because there is such a need for flat AoE in the Divinity fight in particular, but even just normal fights, when you have to deal with light wings that are doing light wings and shade wings that can do 50, you know, between 25 to 50 damage, sometimes more. It's kind of a premium to just have flat AoE, and even if it costs 2, it's still pretty premium in the DLC world. It's always been a takeable card. I never thought the card was horrible. I did think though that it was obviously not preferable to things like Glimmer and Vent, and maybe that's still the case, but I think the gap between those cards has shrunk in the DLC. So Assuming Blade hasn't changed at all, other than I think it was a pretty premium card back then. It was like, if I couldn't find a Crushing Demise, this was next best on the list. It was technically better, usually, for killing my own units than a Crushing Demise was, because I could target which one dies each turn. Obviously, it was hard to get the damage up to a point it could kill like a Burnout Rector, but it usually could kill any of my backliners, whether that was like an Animus of Will or a Paraffin Thug. And then it had the flexibility to kill any enemy backliner, usually. It just usually wasn't able to kill a tank. And it always did cost a lot, right, too? But I find myself taking this hardly anymore in the DLC world. It's still technically in a vacuum a good card, but I don't know, an overcosted single target removal is not really that important to me, especially when I can often find a piercing upgrade for damage cards at Divine Temples. Certainly not like untakeable. I take it a fair amount of times still, but it was like a premium, like borderline S tier to A tier card back in 1.0. Then Wicked Blaze, this card hasn't changed at all. It was also kind of a premium card. It was right there with Molded. I was always very happy to find this, and you know, add in that Melting really sucked with scaling, and a 10 here is actually pretty good, right? I mean, there wasn't anything else in the arsenal of the Melting Remnant that could give you a for one card, give you a 15 damage increase, you know, factoring in the reform on top of that. So, like, it was a pretty good card. One of the better cards in Melting. Now I hardly ever take it, you know? It's overcosted. By that point, I hopefully have some just better way to do reform. Dark Calling gets taken a lot more. Hallowed Halls is a thing. Yeah, I don't know. I don't find myself taking Wicked Blaze too much these days. I feel like they could increase the damage to 15, and that might make sense. And then Mortal Entrapment, here's a card that I never really liked it in 1.0. It still was probably okay, but I just didn't really find Dazed was nearly as needed as it is now in the DLC world. And it has gone through changes. It now is attuned. I hardly ever find that to be relevant. So, you know, if I upgrade it, I get a bunch more damage, but it does have Dazed 3 now, so it is significantly better on the Dazed front. Not that it was unusable on the Dazed front, but I thought the prerequisite of having to be damaged, coupled with the fact that it costs 3, coupled with the fact that Dazed just wasn't nearly as useful back then, made it not really that good of a card in 1.0. However, these days it's actually a really good card. It still feels weird. It still feels expensive, and it sucks when you can't play it. However, last time I ran my data, is actually one of my best performing cards with a pretty decent take rate. So, you can take those type of bits of data with a grain of salt, but I think it's at least evidence that it's actually a pretty good card now. So, pretty good change they did there. It always felt like, initially I always thought they should have done more, but I think just the world in the DLC world changed enough that it made it a good card. Now we're on to the rares, and first one we got is Wax and Spike. A few changes here. It's funny because it wasn't untakeable back then. I often took this. It's funny because it supported the old game plan better, and then after the change, it kind of coincided with Burnout just getting better, and then it now applies Burnout 4 after that. So it's actually like a pretty takeable card in both scenarios. The weird thing about this card, though, hardly ever are you using it for the actual X cost, right? You're just using it for the burnout effect. So in 1.0, I liked this because it could apply one burnout, and if I hadn't found a burnout upgrade for my backliner, this was my way to get it to start dying. And that's what I took it for. I didn't care about the extra damage. It also technically gives a little bit more damage now. It used to give 3 per ember. It gives 4 per ember now. Ooh-wee. If I had a camera on, you'd see me doing jazz hands or whatever. Ooh-wee. Yeah, I don't care about that portion of it. It's just there as a burnout extender card. So in that sense, it's an oddly designed card, I would say. Because I don't know. It just doesn't seem like it's used for the actual effect. Some of these X-Cost cards are just weird like that. Like Vent, Mind Collapse, Wax and Spike are big culprits of this, where you don't use it for the actual X-Cost effect. And I think that's maybe something that, if they were still actively designing, they could probably rack their heads around and come up with a better solution. I can't come up with a better solution, but I know something has to exist where the actual X-Cost portion could become a little more relevant there. But as it stands, it's just a burnout extender card, and it used to be just a burnout, or just like a death enabler card. Never been great, but always been okay. Sacrificial Resurrection, I would say this card used to be better. And granted, it's not gilded here, but I took this from, I think it was Posh. I had to find an old video someone go through the log book, so props to Posh Lizard for that. So I would say this would have definitely been gilded in my book back then, because it was decently taken. This was a nice card, especially to get if you never found a good banner unit. Because this draft that came out of this thing was always going to be better than most banner units if you had completely missed. It just sucked that you had to wait to find it, but eventually you find it, and you just have to get your reform going at that point. But it was also nice just to thin out your deck. Diligent wasn't so devastating back then, and I could even take it into Diligent. Yeah, I mean, think about, again, the context of how bad scaling was for Melting Remnant, and the 10 here on a draft makes quite a lot of sense, actually, as being a pretty good card. I hardly ever take it nowadays, though. I think it, even though the card itself hasn't changed, the climate of the game this is one of the most affected cards negatively, I would say. I legitimately, every time I take it, is me forcing to try to find value out of it just because I'm bored. I could argue it almost has no place in most decks. You could say, yeah, it's good etch triggers, but at the point you find this, maybe you lucked into just going out on a whim for an etch deck. I don't know. I still don't think it's that good for an etch deck, but that's just me. Anyway, Wickless Recruitment. Yeah, here's an interesting card. I never took it back then, ever. It's another card that wasn't changed, but kind of opposite of Sacrificial Resurrection. I find myself taking it a somewhat decent amount in the DLC world. Because there are more there is a melee weakness to deal with. There's probably a little bit more Ember Drain that you can use it for as well, just top floor in general, but also I find, you know, Umbra Ember Drain is pretty good, and this can get you the ability to do that. But also, you know, in the context that Burnout Extension is better, I do find this is pretty good for that as well, because it is pretty useful sometimes if you had a bad Burnout Extension deck to just, like, say you just have some single target Burnout Extension and you can't support a wide floor. Well, you can just use Wickless Recruitment on like one of your units if it makes sense to do so. Like, often there are cases where it can make sense to put this on a Paraffin Enforcer that had a Giraffe infusion and just have it keep applying its strike effect to the other burnout units on the floor. And it also is pretty good with Fade's First Blade. Back then, Fade's First Blade didn't exist. You know, if you weren't aware, you could just take all the burnout stacks in a unit, delete them all, and Fade's First Blade will apply all of the rage at once to that unit. So it actually becomes like a ritual, a zero-cost ritual of battle in that case a lot of the time. But it's still not like a super great card, I would say. And then Bounty Stalker, not a whole lot changed. Well, okay, a whole lot did change here. But stat-wise, the only thing that changed is it used to even be more powerful, if you can believe it. It got 10 on attack permanently. Now it has only 8. Oh, just unplayable now, right? Just kidding. But actually, in the context of the original card, having that extra stat increase kind of made sense. You know, think about it this way. Draft into Bounty Stalker was not a thing. But also, the big thing that was weird about this is it's the only banner unit in the history of the game, at least from 1.0 on, that you could find past Ring 4. It just sort of, for whatever reason, it was different than Big Sludge, different than Legion of Wax. It was still a banner that you could find at banners. It was still a priority draw unit. Yet for whatever reason, it also existed in the rare drafts. So it was one of the 8 rare drafts that existed. They changed that at the point where they added like Hallowed Halls. It became only a banner unit, but it is just kind of funny. I kind of liked it, to be honest. Like, because often you could make a decision come like Ring 6, for example, which was you're most likely to have this weird decision on Ring 6, right? Where it's pretty late in the run, but it gave you a Bounty Stalker, and maybe it, you know, in just a simple 3 rings, you could actually make it be better than your banner unit that you currently had. So I don't know. I actually kind of liked the weirdness of it before, but it makes sense that they changed it, I suppose. Devour of Death, here's a card that has always sucked, it still sucks. At least now it has an essence that makes it usable, but you know, the only change it really had is back then it was a tomb. And why isn't it anymore? It doesn't make any sense to me. This is one of those weird changes. I'm like, so the little benefit it might have been able to gain from the tomb artifacts is now gone. I guess the only thing I can think of is that they didn't want it to interact with Melting Spout. Which is weird, because I don't know. I honestly don't know. It's always been a card that doesn't make much sense to me. It's like, it's a one-time splash. I don't know what the use case for this card is. Because it has to be like behind units to get harvests, or it needs to have AoE played on the floor the turn that it's like already there. So why is more further AoE needed at that point? And also, if your units are dying and this is just a one-time bomb, like, again, I don't really get what the point of that is. It's just a weird card that I don't think is very good. I guess maybe Intent on Death back then was the use case for this card. I don't know, you get a chicken egg problem there in either case. It's like, you're going to take one or the other, and the card generally would only interact with each other, so to a great extent, so I don't know. It just never was a good card. In my eyes, it still isn't. But at least I can use the Essence every now and then now. The Essence is that it applies 15 damage on Extinguish to the entire floor. Remnant Pack, nothing's changed here. It's always been a pretty useful card. Always cost 1, it always applied endless. It is interesting that it's like the only application of a status effect that persists on death. You know, if I put a one-horn tome on a unit, it's not going to reform, or it's not going to come back, even if say I put endless. Let's say I put a Remnant Pack on a Train Steward, a vanilla Train Steward, right? A single striking. And let's say it dies, and it comes back and I play it again, it still has endless. So, you know, the status is now applied to it for the rest of that fight. But if I put one Horn Tome, or even a Quick Tome on that unit, and say I even put endless on it as well, it dies, it does not come back with multi-strike, it does not come back with quick, but it still has the endless. So it's weird that there's nowhere in the text of the card that explains that it should be different than the other tomes, but that is how it's always been. It's just kind of a weird one. I like it, it's just confusing and inconsistent, right? It would be significantly worse if it didn't apply that through the whole fight, by the way. So that's why it's like I like it, but it should say, there should be a way to word it that makes it distinguished from the others. Big Sludge used to kind of suck, in my opinion. Rage 2 was not nearly enough. You know, if you think about it, like, that's less than a Fledgling Imp's old summon effect, which was already arguably kind of questionable of the Rage 3. You know, it was always a 2-cost 3-pip unit, and Rage 2 just wasn't that much. It wasn't unusable, but it just didn't really feel like that powerful of a unit. And then at some point they upped the Rage big time to Rage 5. You know, some of these changes they made were like, oh wow, we're gonna go big here. And I would say at that point in the game, Big Sludge was one of the better rare units in the game when it got that Rage 5 buff. Now it's kind of gone back a little bit just because, like, you know, the thing is, a unit could get by without multi-strike, without trample, just being like a pretty high attack unit back in the day, because there weren't these gigantic divinity waves, right? That they just weren't there, where there's 3 tanks of 200 plus health that you got to take out. I think it's still a usable unit, but it is certainly not the unit it was at the point it changed to Rage 5. But definitely at Rage 2, it wasn't that good of a unit. It was marginally usable, but usually a skip. And then Formless Child, you know, oddly enough, no real changes here. Weird that it was at, like, they knew to put this unit at 1 health, but none of the other tombs. I don't know what the deal there was. But yeah, for the record, it's never changed. It's always been a tomb. It's always been 2 cost. It's always giving that amount of attack. Yet somehow, even though with all of the scaling starved situations I found myself in with Melting Remnant, I found myself rarely taking this card. I definitely take it more now than I took back then. Now, I don't know if that is because the card is like better now, but I think it's always been a hard card. I think this is more a thing of like, I just wasn't as good at the game back then, and Formless Child is not an easy card to use. It's one of the hardest cards to properly use in the game, I would say. And it is technically quite powerful when you can actually use it to its intended benefit, but it's just so hard to use. Like, the 2 Ember is a big sticking point, but also, like, you really have to get back the proper unit. So, like, it needs to die in the right order, and you need to have your pool curated enough. And like I said, back then, curating reform pools was only something I feel people got really good at once primitive molds became a thing, and then we're kind of forced into it, right? Like, Formless Child was probably a pretty good card back then, but I'll be honest, I just didn't use it that much. Legion of Wax, no real change here. I always never really liked it in vanilla though that much. It was one of those cards that I would say though, like, if you weren't doing the melting game plan, could be a pretty good add to a deck. You know, you could even stick a large stone on it and it wouldn't really deal with the waves, but the big thing is it would pretty much take care of most of the relentless fights for you single-handedly. That was really what I used it for back then. It was probably a little bit more usable than I gave it credit for, but certainly once the DLC hit is when this card, I think, found its stride. Because it was just one of the most fun cards to use with all the various stuff you could do. I've kind of gotten a little more boring with my use of it these days though, because usually nothing is going to beat an Entombed Explosive into it, or even a Giraffe into it. However, there are cool things you can do, like Wickless Tycoon into it. Means quite a lot of gold. But again, I just don't really value gold that much. But you can do some pretty nutty stuff with it. It is worth noting that I know I haven't really gone over DLC changes much, because there really haven't been much, but it is worth noting that the essence of Legion of the Wax did change from the initial DLC variant to what we get today. It used to just be that it would, on Extinguish, it would summon 2 basic copies of Twin Wax. So when they say basic copies, that means no stat enhancements, no status enhancements. It was just vanilla 8/8 or whatever Twin of Wax. Not really that good, right? Not good at all. I mean, it was just bad. And then they did change it eventually to be a revenge trigger, which is weird to me. It's definitely more usable now, but it kind of falls into that territory of like, usually you just want to infuse something into Legion of Wax. That's always going to be more powerful than using its essence. But it is like technically a pretty good essence now in a vacuum. If we assume that Legion of Wax couldn't take essences so well from other sources, it would be a good essence to put on, say, a Big Sludge, or a frontlining Big Sludge, or a frontlining Wickless Baron in particular. Really like it. You know, every time it gets hit, spawns a unit. It's an extra free harvest, blocks the next hit, rinse, recycle, repeat. Really good into Relentless as well. I just generally think you're better off putting stuff into Legion though. But yeah, the actual unit itself has not changed since 1.0. And then the final one we have here is Memento Mori, which used to be a rare, if you could believe it. It's uncommon now, and that's all that changed. It sucked back then, it sucks now. It really needs a glow up. It should not cost 3. Make it cost 1. Honestly, just make it cost 1. It won't even be that good. But it will be usable, and it will make sense to add to some decks. Make it cost 1. That's all I gotta say. And then the final bit we have here is Rector. So obviously Fade didn't exist back then, so we're not going to look at that. But 1.0 Rector was interesting, right? Oddly enough, Burn Bright was technically better back then. Both from just the stats were better, but especially from it was just the ideal Rector to have by a long shot in 1.0. You look at like Harvest Rector. Well, let's just go through them one by one. So Rector Flicker, it used to have initial stats of 60-60, and then 85-85, and then 150-150. And that 150-150 line was so good for the end game of the original game. You know, it basically killed every tank other than a Gilded Wing, and was just a few damage increases or a few reforms that eventually would kill a Gilded Wing in one hit. And it had a ton of health into like all the bosses. It was just an incredible card, incredible champ path, super strong at all points of the game, like 60-60. I mean, think how good Titan Channel is, even in the Divine World at like a 45-45. 60-60 is insane. It is weird though, because, you know, I look at it now, yeah, it has slightly less stats, right? Like now, it gets less stats basically at all stages. It's a 50-50 at stage 1, and 80-80 at stage 2, and a 145, 145 at stage 3. Not a big difference, right? But it just, 145, 145, even if it remained at 150, 150, that's not going to change anything. It just isn't enough, that third rank. I think I have major disagreements with a lot of people that think, or well, I'm not going to say they think, like they could be correct, right? But they think, or they say that Burn Bright is like a fine path still, and I really just have heavy disagreements there. I think that it still crushes rings 1 through 2. I mean, if you look at Soul Guard Titan Channel, right, which I love that path, very in line with phase 1 and 2 of Soul Guard, right? About the same stats. But then it just doesn't get that third rank glow up that Soul Guard gets. Soul Guard's looking at 210, 210, which is enough to be relevant against Divinity. But 150, 150 isn't really relevant. It's not killing a tank, and it's not even coming close enough to kill a tank. Like Soul Guard, technically, if it never gets a stat increase, still doesn't technically outright kill a tank, but it doesn't take much to get there. 20 damage from a spell or something is very reasonable, or a bit of frostbite from something else. But at 150, you're not killing any tanks, and even with a pretty good AoE spell to support it, you're still not killing a tank with that. Not only that, but you're just surviving way less. So, I don't know. I really don't think Burn Bright is good anymore because of the third rank. First 2 ranks are great, but I think all in on Burn Bright is significantly gimped in the end game. I don't think you have much of a champ in that case. Now, Accumulator is an interesting one because when it was always thought of as kind of a weak path in 1.0, in my opinion. I certainly didn't like it that much. All it did was gain health at all stages. Gains the same amount of health as it does now, but at some point it also has the same base stats at each path, but it did change at one point to gain 1 attack at the first rank, 2 attack at the second rank, and 4 attack at the final rank. And it started to become a little bit more usable at that point. That's still pre-DLC. But I don't know, I find the attack pretty irrelevant, if I'm being honest. It's just not enough. It was enough back then, but in the DLC world, I don't find it to be enough. Like, I'm about as disappointed to get stuck with a full Accumulator as I am to get stuck with a full Burn Bright. I'd almost say I'm more disappointed in full Accumulator than Burn Bright, because at least Burn Bright, the first 2 ranks, is kind of wreck and face, but the Accumulator to me is weak at all ranks if I'm just having Accumulator. Now, of course, if I have it mixed with Dark Calling, it's amazing. Because now it is actually becoming the tank that I want it to be. I don't need a 3rd rank of Accumulator. Even 1 rank is pretty good, but 2 is the ideal. And then Dark Calling 1. But that, I'm getting on a tangent there. The main thing to see here is that Accumulator was purely a tank back then. Didn't gain any attack, and I think it sucked. And then Dark Calling has gone through a few different iterations, actually. I do kind of wonder if it actually was okay still. Alright. Alright. Sorry about that. Had to get rid of the lyrics in my background music because it's annoying as shit. Anyway, Dark Calling. It used to reform just 1 unit at rank 1 and not give any benefit to the attack. So it was obviously just significantly worse as a rank 1 of. It's a very powerful rank 1 in its current form, but we'll get to that in a bit. And then rank 2, it just reformed 2 units. Rank 3, it reformed 3 units. So at only the 3rd rank could you ever see a tangible benefit of the original Dark Calling versus the current version. But another thing to keep in mind is that for what it's worth, the base stats were even a bit worse here. You see this 3rd rank has 40-40. Well, the current version, if you were to go all 3, it would be 50-50. I mean, it's not huge, but it is something, right? So the base stats get a slight buff, but more importantly, the way that the reform portion works changed. So the first change that they did was that the first rank it reformed 2 instead of reforming 1. Still didn't give any stats, but then rank 2 did +5. So worse than the current rank 2, which does +10. But then the third rank got a power spike and went up to 15, which actually matched what we currently get. So now the current version of it is same thing, you know, it's just that the first rank you get to +5, second rank you get +10, third rank you get +15. It's interesting because, like, design-wise, I actually think the previous iteration made more sense because there was actual tangible benefit to going all 3 into Dark Calling, right? I'd argue now there just isn't much benefit when you're only getting 5 at each rank. Like, I already get a really good version of Dark Calling in the first rank. You know? It technically gives more scaling than the first rank of Firelight even. However, once you get to the second and third rank, it significantly falls behind Firelight, especially in the context that you're still hard limited to just 2 reforms a turn. And those units aren't going to be dying every turn outside of very specific decks, right? So I've never been a huge fan of the current version of going all in on Dark Calling. But again, I don't really want to get too much into the tangent there. I think this pretty much wraps up how the game looked at 1.0 versus it looks now. Definitely Dark Calling was a lot different, right? I do kind of wish, though, you know, just on the final note there, I do kind of wish that the third rank of Dark Calling now just reformed 3 as well as kept the 15 stat increase. I think that would give you sometimes reason to go all in on Dark Calling versus flexing into Accumulator whenever it comes up. To me, the current version of Dark Calling very similar to Strangler Wildenton. It's like really good for 1 rank, and then there's not a whole lot of benefit to additional ranks, and you usually just want to flex to something else, even if that something else isn't that good. Say like a, you know, Strangler Thornlord isn't technically that amazing, but it just makes more sense than going all in on Strangler, because you're just always going to have more stats, you're always going to have more utility there. I would argue the same with like going Accumulator and Dark Calling. But anyway, that does wrap up all the changes. I just thought I'd have a few final closing thoughts here. That it is interesting to me that looking at the state of you know, of Melting Remnant, you know, we look back, so many things got buffed, right? And almost nothing got nerfed. The only things that got nerfed were Engulfed in Smoke. Arguably Intent on Death, I would say no. And about just ever so slightly, a nerf to the damage of Bounty Stalker, and ever so slightly a nerf to the stats of Burn Bright. I mean, we're talking 5 stats, but yeah, I don't know. It's interesting that somehow through all of this, Melting was my favorite clan back then. It was. They had to have been the worst. Either that, like, at that state in the game, I just don't see how they weren't the worst clan, but they were my favorite. They were the one that I learned Covenant 25 with. They're the first one I was able to really get any sort of a win streak on Covenant 25 with. And I think a big part of it, you know, this is just a general game design thought I had, is like the severe lack of just scaling of kind of quote-unquote dumb game plans, like easy ones. Just, it wasn't there. Like, you know, I could argue a lot of times it ended up kind of dumb, but a lot of the time it wasn't. Like, a lot of time it really took a lot of creativity to put together a melting deck that worked back then. And it usually involved reforming, which was just a really cool concept, and you really had to like time things a lot of the time and get a little creative with how you're going to build that deck to actually figure out how to scale. And I don't know. I think it was just the most fun clan back then. Now I don't. You know, of course I could still do reform stuff, but it's like now the most powerful stuff in Melting Remnant generally just involves very, you know, I hate to use the term, but like brain dead stuff, like Hallowed Hall's holdover, or get a floor of Paraffin Enforcers and let them just strike things, you know, and Burnout extend the floor, like, and it's just way more powerful than any of the alternatives. So it's like, unless you're really going out of your way to not go the strongest route, to me, Melting is a much more boring clan than it used to be, which I don't think is, you know, it's a criticism, but it's not an unrecoverable criticism. I just hope that, you know, I don't know. This is something I guess we could fix with mods, right? But like modding the game. I've had a thought to do it. You know, I basically have had a thought to kind of do a different take. You know, Dusk has a really good, you know, balance patch that kind of balances everything out. I thought of maybe doing a different take on it, which was like balance, but just bring everything down. Basically, don't buff anything and only nerf stuff, so that the game is just harder. I thought about basically like saying like Monster Train hard mode or something, and I think it would force a little more creativity in builds. Like the balance patch already does force, or it enables more creativity in builds, I should say. I think what I would like to maybe do is force creativity in builds, if that makes sense. It'd be a really tough task, but I do think like the old version of Melting Remnant was just, you really had to think more to play it, and it was fun as a result, because difficulty does provide fun, right? This is why I often want to run tough seeds, like especially the egg stapler seeds, right? Obviously they can be frustrating too, but like you know, you look at the success of a game like Slay the Spire, I think a lot of it comes from the difficulty. I really like I like Monster Train more than any other game in the world, so it's not like I'm saying the game is less than Slay the Spire or anything, but I do think that it is probably a little too easy at the max difficulty rating. It's tough because the general public wouldn't say that, right? So it's like, from a game design perspective, you don't want like negative reviews on your game. If you look at the DLC reviews, most of the negative ones are complaining that it's too hard, right? So I get the conundrum, but I guess this would be like a good thing to tackle in like a mod or something. But definitely, I think, even though the clan just sucked back then, it was the most fun to play. So I don't know, just a thought I had. But you know, who knows if we'll actually put the work in. I know that's a ton of work. I know Dusk put a shitload of work to even get that the unofficial balance patch to where it is. So it's like a very big undertaking to take on a task like that, but it is a thought I had, because I don't really know, you know, I got the I have a whole month queued up, by the way, of videos for the 200 shard challenges, which are fun, but eventually even the 200 shard challenges, it's a bit of a spoiler, but I will say eventually, you'll see me struggle through them for a while, but eventually I get to the point where even the 200 shard challenges are pretty easy. So I don't know, I do need something to like add difficulty to the game if 200 shards is already getting like too easy. But anyway, that will do it for this. I'm going to go on to Hellhorn next, because I think that's the other clan that has gone through the most changes. And I'll do it for the other 3 clans as well, but definitely I'm excited to do the Hellhorn one, because Hellhorn went from easily my most hated clan in the game to my most favorite, so it'll be cool to like review the changes that made that a thing, right? Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. Until next time, hopefully that was an interesting video. Until next time, peace.